Thunderbirds is pretty cool. I don't recall how I ended up stumbling across this somewhat obscure, quintessential bit of British 60s sci-fi, but it managed to grab the attention of my early high school self in such a relentless way. For those unfamiliar, Thunderbirds follows the exploits of International Rescue, an organization dedicated to saving lives when no one else can, using their high-tech, one-of-a-kind rescue machines, the Thunderbirds. There's a rocket plane, there's a heavy transporter, there's a space rocket, there's a mini-submarine, and a space station. None of them are in the same episode together, by the way. The model work really is the star of the show, and some of the techniques pioneered by this team made things like Star Wars possible. David Mitton of Thomas the Tank Engine fame also worked on Thunderbirds. Here's some of his handiwork.
Demolished it almost instantly. Decided. Fly out of this.
I think just about everybody has a show or franchise they were obsessed with in their mid-teens, and, mine was Thunderbirds, which was kind of awkward because up to this point I've only ever encountered 3 other people that were familiar with Thunderbirds. One of them saw it when it came on television the first time in the late 60s. It wasn't exactly a popular fandom to be engrossed with in 2017, but I digress. Thunderbird 2 is pretty cool. As I'm sure all of you know, I love transporter vehicles, gentle giant kind of machines with no teeth. The key aspect of Thunderbirds that I think really speaks to me is that it shows man-made things being used to save lives. Usually, the only military vehicles in the series, which would be hero or villain designs and pretty much anything else, end up falling into a hole or accidentally setting fire to an oil field while playing war. And Thunderbird 2, I think, really encapsulates that whole theme. The ship is massive, smooth, soft, but it still has a serious demeanor about it. So different and distinctly non-military. It's not here to chase down the hood for revenge or anything like that. It's here first and foremost to rescue folks in danger using whatever plot-convenient things it's carrying in this episode. I've always wanted to get a model of this specific version of Thunderbird 2. I'd gotten a small model of the 2015 one, and I definitely like the 2015 one. It's very different in a satisfying way. I had my heart set on the original 1965 one, the very C-130 looking airship. But I was always put off by how expensive some of the models of it were, like the 1/44th scale, 1 to 1/44th scale ones, which aren't all that big, but are, oof. I also wanted one that was to scale with my HO model trains. Most of the commercially available ones are to N scale. I wanted one that was twice that size. And, I've always had this idea in the back of my mind to make one, but it wasn't until I found this wonderful side view photo of the original prop that I started seriously considering building my own. So this started off as a joke. I plopped it into Photoshop and started scaling it to HO model railroad scale, so 1 to 87th scale, based on measurements provided from notes from the show. And I used an HO boxcar as a ruler to confirm all my measurements. And the model would have been 2.5 feet long, which is ridiculous. It would have been huge. There's no way I would have made something like that. And then I discovered that my campus supply store had mount board sheets that were that exact size. And so I took one home and I was like, all right, well, and so I used the boxcar again to check all my measurements, and I drafted out a big skeletal structure for it on this sheet of mount board, and it fit pretty much exactly. So I started building up the skeleton. This part actually went a lot faster than I expected it to. Most of this project was done while I was doing classwork for college. I didn't really work on it during any dedicated periods of time. I would just so when you're doing classwork on a laptop for hours and hours and hours, I kept finding myself getting like neck and shoulder pains, especially when drawing. And sometimes I'd wake up and my whole shoulder just, ugh. So what I started doing was every hour or two, I would stand up, I would work on one of these models for about 5 minutes, like I'd cut a new piece out or glue something on, and then I'd leave it alone for another 2 or 3 hours to get back to work. And usually by the time I'd done that, whatever glue or paint I'd been using had probably dried, and then I'd put another piece on and keep going. And so, probably 5 minutes a time each. But yeah, it was amazing what all you could get done by doing that, and it made me feel a lot better afterwards because, well, my shoulder wasn't in searing pain, and I'd accidentally built something. So Thunderbird 2, when it lands and deploys its pod thing, it actually raises up on a set of legs. The legs on mine are made from pine wood, and they slot into corners using Sharpie marker caps to hold them in. They just happen to be the right size, and I happen to have 4 of them, so why not? One of the problems on the original model were the corners where these legs join. When the pod was dropped out, the front section, the very heavy part, was only held in with a very small amount of material. That's also where they would be holding it up with the strings from, and also where the model rocket motors would be. So the model rocket motors would melt the strings, it would drop, and then it would land on that spot and it would break. And so on mine, I made sure that that wouldn't happen by giving a little more material on that sort of shoulder joint, I guess we'll call it. And so I messed with the proportions a little bit to make that work, but I think it still looks about right. The actual pod itself is actually held in by gravity. The frame of the bottom actually engages to hold up the underside of the main ship. So if you pick it up from under the pod, which is the heaviest part usually, you end up picking up the whole thing. And then to separate it, you pick up the outer edge of the ship, like the thruster things down the sides. If you pick it up from there, the pod drops out. And that's part of a safety thing, so nothing gets bent by accidentally picking it up from a corner or something. And it also just made it very simple to construct. I actually use this to transport things. The pod itself is large enough to hold HO railroad cars, which was kind of the goal from the beginning. That was kind of the joke, because it would carry train cars. But I've used it to carry other things as well. Like one time I went to a local art fair, and I used it to carry things back with me. Things like prints and things that would have been bent up by a bag or something could just slot in there. It was a little more fun, too, than just using a box. Underneath the pod is where the rollers are for the landing gear. There are 8 of them, and they're made out of steel bobbins. Again, they just happen to have these at the supply store, and they just happen to work. There's also a 9th one that is used as the rescue winch. So the skin on this made me really anxious to put on, because the ship is, as you can see in a lot of these pictures, it's very smooth. It's, all curves and things, and so if I'd used clamps in certain spots, there would have been really weird marks left over from where it would have been held. And there's not a lot of spots to hold on to it while it's doing that. So in a few instances, I actually had to manually stand there and hold these pieces while they were drying for about 10 minutes. Yeah, my hand was like frozen afterwards. It was not fun. Yeah, it came out pretty nice, but there's still a few gaps in areas that I had to put in with like little bits of filler material. I think it looks okay for the most part, though. At the back of the ship is the tailplane. It was pretty straightforward because it's really just this box girder thing with 4 little separations. On the actual model, there's lots of little greebles and stuff in there, but I figured that I'd make those as separate pieces later so I could paint them silver without having to mask off the rest of the ship. So the first thing that was really finished was the pod, because it's a much simpler shape. Since that was finished first, that's what I did all my test paints with. So I had this gloss green spray paint that I had access to, and it's much darker than the show version. The Thunderbird 2 in the show always looked very light green. But when I sprayed it on, I kind of liked how it looked. It looked a little more like one of the toy versions, but I don't know, just something about that darker green, that sort of gloss tone to it, I thought it looked kind of cool. And since mine's not supposed to be screen accurate, I figured that's what I would use for the rest of it. So, yeah, I was actually thinking of using a lighter green to get in and do some of the, like, middle parts of the panels to make it look a little bit weathered and sun-bleached. I might do that later, but for now I like the way it looks. All of the lettering on the ship was done using a set of stickers, actually. Originally I was going to use decals and stuff like that, but I was at a art store and I found these sticker sheets that were the same font. There was the Futura font, if you're curious. And they were printed nicely, they were about the right size, and so I went with those. My original plan was actually to use those as stencils. So I would prime the ship in white, put all the lettering stickers on, spray it again in green. The stickers would cover up the spots where the lettering would go. I'd peel them off and it'd, yeah. But I figured that was a bit complex and there was a risk of like paint bleed and such because these stickers didn't actually stick very well. I had to glue them all in. And yeah, so for right now they are just stickers that have been glued on. But from any reasonable distance you can't really tell, and I think they look okay. I might stencil them later, but I don't know. The actual pod itself is pod number 4. For those of you that are familiar with the show, you'll know there's a continuity error with mine, because there's 6 of them that all have different numbers. Pod 4 is the only consistent one that carries the submarine, and I was originally thinking of making the numbers removable on the pod, but then I realized it kind of, for most people that don't know, it doesn't really matter that much. Might do that later though, like make extra doors for it. Speaking of the pod, I actually made a vehicle to go in the pod. The mole was a quick build that I was doing, just to give the pod something to carry. It's not particularly screen accurate either, but I feel like it completes a scene by having the two of them together. The body itself of the mole is actually a plastic tube from a glue stick. Again, just happened to be the right size. The drill bit was actually made using off-cut bits of mounting board that were recycled from the skeleton of Thunderbird 2. The wheels on it are actually the same bobbins as before. There's actually room to put caterpillar tracks on these. I don't have any caterpillars that are the right style for it, but we'll see about that later on. I gave it a few greebles and bits of detail, and then I weathered it, made it absolutely filthy as per the show version, and I feel like it looks pretty good. Originally, there was no deadline for this. Usually, I just build these things, again, just to give my spine a bit of a break from drawing. Usually, they're finished whenever they're finished. But Halloween was approaching when I was getting this thing ready for paint and so on. And so I figured that, I could at least get it presentable and in one piece before Halloween. So I actually was cosplaying as Virgil from Thunderbirds because, I had the ship, might as well get the suit. As you may be able to gather from these, I am like ideally proportioned to be a Thunderbirds puppet. My arms are frail, and I am that, the glowing image of masculinity right here. So I walked around with it, got a fair bit of attention, I had a good time, and it was fun. I also made a little Thunderbird 1 to the same scale. That still needs a little bit more paint done. And if you thought this one was big, I also started making a Thunderbird 3 to the same scale. And I also refuse, point blank, to build a Thunderbird 5, as it would be huge and do absolutely nothing. I do have a little Thunderbird 4, though. And I kind of want to make a 0x. 0x in HO scale would be 13 feet long and 6 feet wide, and I have nowhere to store it. I have no idea what I would even do with it, or where I would even set it up. But I don't know, I kind of want one. Those are dangerous thoughts, and definitely should not build one of these. I have no reason, no need for a 0x. But I kind of want one.